Welcome to the Test Mood Board. We have India, Australia, and New Zealand, England. It's been a long day. Bear with me. All right. Let us start with let's start with India, Australia, because that's what's on the script in front of me. And if I do anything differently, Muku will have a panic attack. So I saw a lot of people online wondering about, why the why the Indian middle and tail look so much better than their top order. And you sort of hear these things a lot, at the moment, especially because the Indian top order is not particularly making runs, and a lot of these guys in the middle and the lower order are, right? That makes sense. In fact, Akshar Patel at the moment seems to be saving India almost every innings he bats. Ravi Jadeja is probably their third best batter in the last few years on average. And R. Ashwin, of course, is the pinch hitter and the pinch blocker in T20 cricket, but also making a few runs in Test cricket. Like, it makes sense for you to ask that question. But context is important. And I think if you look at the fact that even when Shreyas Iyer came in to bat, it was clear that the wicket was already playing just that little bit differently. There was just him and Kohli, when they were together, had a little bit more time. Sadly for him, he found Peter Handscomb's belly button or whatever happened with that one. But there's no doubt that by that point, the fast spin had slowed down. And even when the pitch was playing up a little bit, which it wasn't doing massively, but it was still helpful to the bowlers, of course, things were just happening a little bit slower, which means that you could react to them. And by the time that Akshar and Ashwin got together, it just didn't look quite the same wicket that it had been earlier in the day. And there is absolutely no doubt that those two guys deserve their own credit. They are still lower order batters. And while Australia missed a couple of chances, I thought they did a lot of good things to put pressure back on and rotate the strike, find some boundaries, pick their moments, all those sorts of good things. But what I really wanted to look at was the ball and what happens. I think we have this idea in Test cricket that essentially the spinners bowl with the old ball and seamers bowl with the new ball. And I had that theory until I had access to all this data. I always thought that was just, a better way of going about it. But realistically, there is a big difference between the old ball and the new ball when it comes to spin. So spinners may not love the brand new ball, or certainly not all spinners. But if you look from over 0 to 40, and that's obviously quite often bowling at the top order, spinners are far better at that stage of the innings than they are later on. This is a real difference. And you can see it with pace bowling. There actually isn't that much of a difference there. The pace bowlers are more or less exactly the same in the first 40 overs as they are in the next 40 overs. And that's probably not what other people would imagine coming in. But there's no doubt that spinners really do struggle. Now, if you have a look at this for India, the numbers do change a little bit here. And the way that they change is really what happens with pace bowling. So you can see that here in the first 40 overs, spin and pace doing quite well. In the next 40 overs, both of them struggle a lot more. So it's not just spin struggling now, but it is both. But of course, spin is going to do a lot more work in that period. Now, these numbers are last 5 years. That is an era that we've had the wobble ball, and also it's after reverse swing basically died off, right? Or at least maybe died off is too strong a word, but hasn't been used as much as it was, certainly before 2018. So because of that, that might be affecting the seam bowlers numbers here. But either way, the spinners are still struggling between overs 40 and 80. And we've actually seen in this series, this happened twice with Australia. They got themselves into a really, really good position. And then India's very strong lower order got them back in. Now, perhaps Mitchell Starc would help in that situation, although he's not really the tail killer that people kind of make him out to be. But quite clearly, so far, twice Australia have given up good positions because their bowlers couldn't get the squishier ball to help them, as Akshar and friends went on a rampage and got India either back into the game or further ahead like they did in the first test. All right, let's move on to Virat Kohli. His struggles against spin bowling and pace bowling, I suppose, have been well documented of recent times. Although, if you look at him through the history of his career, he's obviously been an incredible player when it comes to facing spin. And in this particular innings, he looked like someone who was back in a little bit of touch. He had a control percentage of 92, which is very, very high. And you can certainly see from this graphic here just how clear he was. This is For those who don't understand spin bowling, this is exactly what you want to do. The best person for this is Joe Root, someone who either has intercepts the ball a long way away or all the way back in his crease. And essentially, it's that middle ground where Virat Kohli here hasn't faced any balls that is the tricky bit. If you're facing balls there, that's generally when the spinners get on top of you. But if you can get back and play them off the back foot with a straight bat, chances are you're going to be okay. And if you get a long way forward, you can intercept them. You know, that would be sweeps or using your feet or just getting out as far as possible and meeting the ball early. This is the way to play spin. And that's what Virat Kohli did today. He found a perfect balance between playing on the front foot 58% of the time and on the back foot 37% of the time. And I just thought he played very, very well. However, he was judged LBW for this. It was a very, very close call. I would say, and it was Nitin Menon, so we're just going to assume he's right because he's right about everything else. But I would say this is one of those decisions where if you take away your personal position, you probably, there's no wrong decision, I think, here. There are certainly going to be people who will say that 100% hit his bat first, and there are going to be other people who said 100% hit his pad first. When you slow down the footage, there's missing frames. So no one can be 100% on this. Everyone's guessing. In this case, it wasn't overturned. And I think the reason that it wasn't overturned is because it was given out on the field. I think if it had been given not out on the field, I think the same thing probably happens. My guess is it probably hit pad first, but that's where the missing frames are. So I have no problem with the decision going in either way. But again, we bring this up partly because people are going to ask about it in the comments anyway. In fact, anyone late to this video will ask because I won't have gone back and seen this bit. But the other reason that I brought it up is that Kohli's luck when it comes to T20 cricket, when it comes to playing spin is actually quite interesting. This is from my man Shiva over at Cricinfo. And you can see here, he's talking about the control data. So we focus as fans more often on wickets and average. But I'll tell you a little bit of story, a very good story about control data, or you can have a look at expected average or all those sorts of things that other analysts use, which was, you may remember there was a point when people thought Jimmy Anderson was coming to the end of his career. Was it a year and a half ago? And it was about the fact he wasn't taking wickets in the fourth innings. And his bowling average suddenly just ballooned in that fourth innings. And so I completely understand a lot of people going, well, wait a minute here. This is because he's old and it's not working. That's because we were just looking at average. But when you did look at control percentage and when you did look at expected average and everything else, you could see that Jimmy Anderson just had a little period where he probably didn't get as much luck going his way. He may not have bowled quite at the level he was at before, but the very bloated average he was getting in the fourth innings probably wasn't also realistic. So if you have a look at this here, and you can see that among the 79 batters to score at least 500 runs against spin, he had the 72nd best average Virat Kohli. So straight away, you're just like, wow, he's not doing very well. But there were times when he looked pretty good at the crease until he was dismissed. That's a little bit different than someone looking perpetually scratchy, right? And if you have a look at the control data that Cricinfo has, his control percentage was the 10th best out of the 79 batters. So that doesn't match up. It doesn't mean that he's not still making mistakes. And it also doesn't mean that perhaps he wasn't making more fatal mistakes when he was making them than perhaps another player. Like Dean Elgar is someone who can have a lower control percentage than anyone else. Rory Burns was another one. They quite often have very low control percentages because even when they make mistakes, they find ways to mitigate the mistakes with either soft hands or the way they edge the ball, all those sorts of things. Devon Conway's another very good one at doing this as well. So I do think from that perspective, you can see that he the interesting stat here is that of the 69 batters who played with lower control than Kohli, 62 have averaged better than him. And so on average, he's been dismissed every 7.6 false shots. Generally in international cricket, you would assume that he would be getting dismissed when he was playing trying to think of the right way of putting it. I think the general dismissal rate for a false shot is every 12 shots. So if he's going every 7.6 shots, then that's not particularly working. Just to point out, I think I said before this was against spin. This control data we're talking about here and the luckometer, if you will, is actually not just against spin. I meant to say against all bowling. But what it does suggest is that when he's made a mistake, every batter makes mistakes. If someone makes a double hundred, they still make a bunch of mistakes in their innings. but generally you get dismissed every 12 deliveries, and you can have periods where that's slightly lower. And it depends, as I said, it depends on the kind of mistake, but it does show you that the numbers don't quite back up the fact that Virat Kohli has had a poor record just because he hasn't been batting as well. The numbers do suggest that, his record hasn't, is worse than he's actually batted. These sorts of things happen all the time. That's why we bring it up. Shiva's work here is really, really good. But you could see it also with players who get dropped a lot, or there have been periods where Stuart Broad has probably bowled very, very well, but there are just more catches dropped off his bowling in that period. So just to bring all that up, because I think it's really, really interesting when looking at Virat, but I thought he batted really well today. Just want to focus on Australia's aggressive attempt in the final overs of the day's play. If you look at Head's wagon wheel here, you will see that Ashwin was bowling way too full to left-handers. I think there was even, maybe it wasn't a full toss, but Head made it into a full toss. I'm not sure if Ashwin was just over-attacking or whether the ball just wasn't landing exactly where he wanted. But, for someone who usually drops the ball pretty much on a pin, it wasn't going exactly well. And Travis Head went for him, right? You can see how many times he went through cover specifically. It's not that often that a left-hander's most productive shot off an off spinner is going to be through cover, especially against Ashwin, because people get a bit nervous about playing that shot at all. That's how he got Usman Khawaja in the last test. So it's really interesting. The other thing is that, there was talk about how Head should have played in the last test. I thought if Head would come in the middle order, I'm not sure I would have seen anything different in that last test. I think he would have struggled in the same positions that Renshaw came in. When I heard they might open him for this test, that was when I thought that's probably a better. I'm not sure it's going to make a huge difference, but I think that's probably a better go, just because it allows him, I think, to attack the rock hard ball, get a couple of boundaries away when the field's up, all those sorts of things. However, that only happened because of the whole David Warner concussion. Maybe David Warner broken arm concussion, whatever you want to call it, situation. And so it's almost an accidental thing. But look, he played really, really well. You have to give him credit. And I've said many times before, Australia didn't want to play him in this series. They're playing him essentially. He's the 8th choice batter. I think that's what I said in a previous one. So it's really, really interesting. But I thought, they went and put pressure on India. And if you go back and have a look at how they played in that first test match, I don't think they put run scoring or single scoring pressure on India. Whereas here, I think there's been a bit more of a clear plan, and the players look a little bit more relaxed. So you don't quite have the frantic batting of someone like Alex Carey from the last test as well. Let's move on to Nathan Lyon. Last week, and I had this question a lot on some of the chats that we did, people were saying things like Nathan Lyon should never play again. Todd Murphy was obviously a better bowler, time to move him on. And people were saying one of two things: either he was washed, or he was not good enough in the first place and was never going to be an above average bowler, in Asian conditions. And, at that stage, Australia did have almost every professional spinner available to them in the country, which was quite interesting. But there was never a chance. I could be completely wrong with this, but I never thought there was a chance that Australia was going to drop him for this test. If he'd come back with similar figures again in this test, yeah, maybe they would have made a decision, but they didn't. And look, this is the difference so far in the 2 test matches. You can see that this is kind of how people's emotions were, right? They were massively high on him in one innings and massively low on him in the other. But that's kind of always the case. That's how people look at these things. And because he took a lot of wickets in one and didn't take a lot of wickets in the other, he wasn't so bad last test that he deserved to have a bowling average of 126. And he wasn't so good in this innings that he deserved to have an average of 13.4. In fact, last test, I thought he struggled at the start, but bowled pretty well in that middle part of the innings until he got a little bit tired, and then Jadeja and Akshar got together and took over. And he should have bowled better against them, but he didn't. But even today, if you look at how well he bowled, I would say that he probably fell into some of his worst habits today. You could argue that when Australia was struggling and that partnership had formed again, he just kind of stayed around the wicket. And I'm not against him going around the wicket. I like him bowling it, and I certainly like that style in India. But he wasn't really threatening that much for big periods of time. And obviously, there was a certain point where that partnership just got away from them. Switching sides would have made sense. And you can see just how little he bowled over the wicket today. Uh, and if you're wondering, he does usually mix up the sides of the wicket a lot more than this. I understand that for India, you might want to bowl around a little bit more, but I just think when it's not working, it's time to go to the other side. And I'm not doing this to nitpick on Lyon or anything. What I'm really trying to say here is that we focus so much on results, and we don't really always look at the quality of the actual bowling. And I think with Lyon, there was an overreaction to his last bowling, and probably a bit of an overreaction to this one. Whereas if you probably went through all the different deliveries and all the different phases, that might have been that this pitch helped him a little bit more. It might have just been that instead of getting plays and misses like he did in the last test, that this time he got edges, and it could have been that the pitch had a little bit more pace in it than that last wicket did. Certainly when he bowled on it, it felt like this wicket was a little bit quicker, which helps him because he's a little bit slower. All these things matter. Talking about Australian spinners, shall we move on to Ashton Agar, who there is no doubt that when he came on this tour, he probably thought of himself as the second spinner. Todd Murphy was probably just better than anyone expected, certainly in the nets. And he ended up taking his spot for the first match, despite the fact that Murphy can't bat, of course. And Agar's batting is usually overrated by people, but at number 8 or number 9, he certainly would have made the tail a lot more solid. And he, as a left-hander, he would have had to face Ashwin, so that would have been a huge challenge for him. But even without Green, Australia's real all-rounder, it was interesting that Agar wasn't picked for that first game. And so he probably went from thinking he was going to play in that test to being disappointed that he wouldn't get a chance. And then suddenly he wasn't getting a chance in the second test either. And at that stage, Agar would have completely believed that he was going to play. I saw some talk about Nathan Horrocks, who was saying how unfair it was on Agar and everything else. And I think we've seen this a lot. Australia does treat their finger spinners very weirdly. Nathan Lyon's treatment throughout the beginning of his career. But Nathan Lyon took, was it 7 or 8 wickets in an Indian test, went to Australia for the Ashes, and they picked Agar. Like, Agar's been the benefit and the person who's struggled with the way that Australia deal with spinners. Obviously, the Matt Kuhneman situation is really interesting. Swepson went home because of family issues. And, Kuhneman comes over straight from Shield cricket. You're talking about someone who took 3 wickets in 2022 at a bowling average of 60, making his debut ahead of Agar. And I think we saw the way he bowled. I don't have any problems with that. I also don't have any problems with them making that decision. But you have to ask why Kuhneman wasn't on the tour to begin with. If there was ever any chance that he was going to be a better specialist spinner than Agar, and remember, Agar's more of a all-round spinner, why wasn't Kuhneman around? And I could see again why Agar would be a little bit confused by all of this. There is one really interesting thing, though, that I think is worth pointing out. It's that Agar hasn't really had a chance over the last couple of years to push his name forward. He's here because on the occasions where Australia has used him as a backup spinner, he's been quite fine. But he just doesn't play first-class cricket anymore. He's played 10 games in the last 4 years, and in them he took 20 wickets at an average of 60. Now, with you got to remember that he bowls a lot at the Wacker, in Western Australia, on Wacker-like wickets. But Australia still took him over. Like, that, it's not his fault. Like, these are his numbers, and he was selected. So Australia made that decision. But I do think it's really interesting that, for Agar, he went from probably thinking he was the number 2 spinner in this squad and probably think he was the number 2 all-rounder to being overlooked for roles in consecutive tests, even with injuries around. And now you would say he's the 4th choice spinner on this tour. And I don't know if Swepson comes back, does Agar move to the 5th choice spinner at that point? And I suppose the big question about Agar is, how bad has he been bowling in the nets? Or how well has everyone else been bowling in the nets that's made him look bad? On to England, or New Zealand, England. This was a very bad day for New Zealand cricket. And it did start very, very early on with their bowling. If you're on this channel, chances are you know everything you need to know about Neil Wagner's bowling. Although, weirdly, I do have another video coming up on him because of I do. But he is exceptionally famous for being probably the shortest bowler, the shortest short bowler, I suppose, in some ways, but the shortest bowler when it comes to lengths in the world, just consistently so much shorter than other people. He bowls shorter lengths than bowlers who are brought in just to bowl short. So that just tells you how ridiculous he has been. But of recent times, certainly since he slowed down a little bit, and perhaps as he started to age, he has actually started to pitch the ball up a lot more, and he's been working on his swing bowling again, which is something he had when he was younger. But he's Wagner, and so he still can't help the short balls. So he's bowled a few in this test match, but it should be pointed out that oh yeah, sorry. This is this is the entire history of. These are all the balls that have been recorded by Hawkeye of Wagner, and we've divided them by balls that are shorter than 9 meters and balls that are fuller than 9 meters. He's actually the only bowler, with a record anything like this. I think he's got was 124 or 123 wickets with the balls shorter than 9 meters. Broad has, I think, 80 or 90, and Mitchell Johnson has 78 or 79, I think, off the top of my head. CricViz were telling me all this today. And so it is kind of just ridiculous that, Mitchell Johnson, who's known for short pitch bowling, Stuart Broad, who's a lot taller than Neil Wagner, and they're nowhere near the kind of percentage that Neil Wagner is doing. But this test match, it wasn't just him. Scott Kugelin has bowled very, very short, in fact, shorter than Wagner in this test match. We've seen Stuart Broad, Blair Tickner, and Ollie Robinson all go through periods where they bowled a lot of short balls in this game. And as it currently stands, 10 wickets have fallen through the pull and the hook shot in this test. That's actually, according to CricViz, the record for the most, or equal record. There's another test match between South Africa and New Zealand that had the same, which does tell you just how remarkable and how short the bowling has been in this test match at Mount Maunganui. But of course, I want to focus on Wagner for a moment. If you have a look at his wagon wheel from the second innings, you'll see that despite the fact him bowling short, it didn't actually stop England hitting him for a lot of boundaries. And they attacked him in two very, very different ways. One of them was forehand down the ground. So you can see that there's a bunch of boundaries on to mid-off and also towards mid-on. Most of those were bounces or short balls where they gave themselves room and just played a forehand. And the other thing that they did, and this was more Ollie Pope and Joe Root, is because they knew he was going to be bowling short and at their body, they got inside the ball like in a premeditated way, and then they tried to go up with the ball. And again, you'll see that there's 4 sixes down at fine leg there. And those sixes, I think all of them went directly over the head of a fielder. I mean, the field was set for that delivery, and they just took him on and got it. So it was really, really interesting that they kept going with it. Now, he actually had some success, of course. He took a couple of wickets, and they weren't taking a lot of wickets. So New Zealand just decided that they would just keep going with this. And that actually ended up with, after 11 overs, he had the highest economy rate of any bowler of more than 10 overs in a test match ever. Luckily for him, he did come on for one more spell, and he managed to end up with only the second highest economy rate ever for a bowler in test match cricket. Absolutely remarkable. New Zealand were trying to buy a wicket, and it certainly cost them a lot. The reason it costs so much is because obviously England are going all in with attacking shots, because generally what Wagner has been able to do is actually control run rates by bowling this method. But England don't allow him to control the run rate, which means if he wants to keep bowling bounces for long periods of time, it's going to come with a cost. For those who don't know, these are the strike rates in test match cricket by shot. I think this is over the last 2 or 3 years. Just trying to remember when we actually looked this up. But this is the last 2 years. So you could see that both the hook shot and the pull shot go at a runs per over of more than 10. They're not quite the most expensive shots. Obviously, there's some other shots here, including I think I found 5 occasions where someone had played a reverse pull in the system. It's good shot, the reverse pull, if you can work it out. But and the slog sweep is probably one of the most effective shots in cricket. You've got the uppercut, which there's almost never a third. So you're either playing and missing that, or you're probably hitting that for a boundary. And then just a normal slog shot, which is always going to have a high economy. But you can see the hook, very, very high yielding shot, and the pull shot, a very, very high yielding shot, right? And so when Wagner used to do this, people would be a little bit more reticent to play those shots against him because he got a lot of wickets doing that. Whereas England went absolutely all in, but they also exploited the field because he didn't have a mid-off and a mid-on. They played those flat-batted shots. So I don't even sure where they would end up here. Are they just slog shots? I don't even know how you would classify those shots. The point is that New Zealand kept going and they were willing to buy a wicket. The problem was for them that they had to pay double the market rates. But considering that Wagner has cashed in all of his career, maybe he could afford a day like this. I would just want to talk about the pink test a little bit because these day-night games are very much about the new ball. Other than the new ball, the only other things that really help you are bowling under lights, and sometimes you get some assistance at dusk as well when people are just, and in both those situations, it's not that the ball does that much more. In fact, it doesn't seem any more under lights. It swings 12% more. So again, not that much, but a little bit. But mostly it's that the batters are just not seeing the ball as well. And so you either need to take wickets with the new ball, or you need to get lucky and bowl well at, either at dusk or in the dark period. Or the opposition needs to be really crap, I suppose, is the other one. But generally what happens is that the pink ball isn't as good as the red one. And so it doesn't necessarily help you as much, once the steam goes out of it. Now, I'm mentioning this because New Zealand have been absolutely terrible with the new ball in this game, whether they're holding it or trying to hit it. This is the first 10 overs average. So across both innings so far, there's bad and there's a dumpster full of burning used nappies. And then there's New Zealand's average with the bat and the ball against the new ball in this game. They've been absolutely terrible. England have completely had their way with New Zealand's top order. And when New Zealand bowled at England's top order, I mean, Ben Duckett is probably still laughing at the amount of half volleys he got. And they just weren't particularly good, again, even in the second innings, although they weren't as bad as they were this time. The interesting thing about this is you can see that New Zealand bowlers are averaging 60. That's not good. And England's bowlers are averaging 10. But England's bowlers only took 4 wickets and New Zealand bowlers took 2. So you would expect the averages to be a lot closer, but certainly not 6 times higher anyway. But that actually comes to economy. Because 2 things happened with the new ball here when it comes to economy. One is, obviously, we know that England are going to bat very fast. But the other one is that New Zealand actually batted incredibly slow. And it's the combination of that have made those first 10 overs just... I don't know. What's worse than a knockout? It's, New Zealand have almost been like a boxer who fell over on the way into the ring. And concuss themselves as they were trying to, move the ropes or something like that. It's been very, very bad. Now, you can talk about Bazball all you want. But as I said before, New Zealand also it doesn't matter who you're bowling against. If you're giving opening batters, throw down balls repeatedly, or bowling the, balls down the leg side, or not creating any pressure at all, the other team is going to do very well against you. Whereas the England bowlers, in comparison, absolutely nailed their lines and their lengths. Some of the balls that they bowled over the 2 innings to the best batters from New Zealand have been absolutely incredible and would have got any batters in the world in trouble. But this is essentially where New Zealand lost this test. They got punched in the face very, very early on. And in some ways, they've done well to keep themselves in the game as long as they did, because I don't think they've been particularly impressive at any stage during this match. And looks like it's going to be a horrendous loss considering how close they were after the first innings had been completed by both sides. All right, shall we get to some questions? I will play an ad, take a breath, try not to fall asleep. I don't know how many hours I've now been working and watching Test cricket continuously, but it feels like quite a lot in not the best time zone for me.
There is something wrong in the cricket world, and while it may not be a conspiracy, there does seem to be a movement towards leaving more grass on the wicket, and thusly, the global batting average has dropped. If a similar thing has happened to you in your personal life, try Manscaped. Their Lawnmower 4.0 will help you trim any unwanted pubic grass. And once your downstairs track is taken care of, you can also use Manscaped's liquid formulations. So before heading outside, use the Crop Preserver Ball Deodorant to stay cool in the heat. And if you've been playing too many games recently and you need some help with your strip, why don't you go and get their Crop Reviver? I think I may possibly have taken all of this analogy too far. But the point is, Manscaped sells items that allow you to shave your pubic itch pitch. Use the code REDINKER, all one word, which is the name of my podcast, and you can get a 20% discount and free worldwide shipping while you curate your special strip like a team of sweaty men hoping it doesn't rain.
All right, perfect. Okay, remember, if you want your question definitely answered in any of these mood boards, the best way to do that is to put in a super chat. But if not, I just go through and quickly try and read the ones and answer the ones I think are worth looking at. Like this one from Bob B, who says, thoughts on Steve Smith's catching? I've got a theory that is probably more a theory that works in Asia than anywhere else, that older batters shouldn't field in slips. And the reason I think that is the case is that most older batters have terrible backs. And the reason you get a terrible back is because if you bat for an extraordinary amount of time in your life, the bending over and everything else eventually takes a toll. Now, some people just get stiff backs. Some people get proper back injuries, but it's a very common thing. And you want to be able to start very low if you're fielding a slip to a spinner, especially in Asia. And the ball, occasionally the ball will take a top edge, and occasionally edges will fly. But it's much easier to go from low to high than from high to low. And if you look at Smith, I wonder if he's just not got to that point in his career where he actually finds it hard to go low because of his back. And if that's the case, then, you're going to miss easier chances that you should get. It's interesting that Kohli and Smith over the last two tests have both missed some chances. And not just that, just looked a little bit sluggish at times, I thought. There was just a couple of times when they just wouldn't have looked like that when they were younger. Not to say that I don't think Kohli was ever an excellent slip fielder to spinners, but even so, it does take a toll on you a little bit. It's a real specialist position, and I think some teams get that and some teams don't. And I wonder if it is it's a better option to actually maybe just move that around to someone else who might be better at it, and give someone else a go. But it could just be that they are stiff and or slow, or with Kohli, could have just been one of those days when he missed his, and the same with Smith. It just doesn't feel that way to me, if I'm being honest. Yuvashant says, is it better to bowl the wobble ball and seam the ball like Broad did today than to swing the ball when it's new? So the difference between these two, and I will eventually get to this article, of course, but I don't know how many years I've been writing it now. It's probably going to be like a 20-hour documentary by the time me and Muku get around to making it. But I think the most interesting thing is that when you bowl swing bowling, what you were doing is you were giving the batter an idea of what is supposed to happen. They could see your wrist. And the other thing that swing bowling does is the ball actually starts to move a little bit early on. Now, a really good swing bowler will swing the ball late, but even so, there is a point at which the ball is starting to fade in the direction that it is going to go. That's what batters are looking for. They see the wrist, they see the seam position, and then they see the ball start to fade away, and they realize what's happening. Wobble ball takes all of that away, right? So if you have the advantage, you always go with that. If you go back to what the West Indian bowlers did in their heyday, everyone talks about the fast bowling aspect of it. And quite clearly that played a part, and the bounces and the slowing the game down so they could bowl more seam in a day. All those things played a part. But the real thing that they did is they took the game from an swing-dependent culture and they made it a seam-dependent culture. And there's no doubt that if you can get seam movement, it is better than swing bowling just because it happens a little bit later. And also it's harder to notice. Unless you're bowling an actual cutter, so leg cutter or an off cutter, and if you're just running in and trying to hit the seam, there's not a lot of tips there for for the batter to actually be picking up. Maybe if you've got a slightly slanted seam, or you as I said, you're doing something with your hand, there's just a lot less there. And even if there is any tips there, until the ball is bounced, you can't be sure what it's going to do. So I think in general, those are much better options than swinging the ball. But it's not to say that swing bowlers aren't still handy. Swing bowlers can move the ball further. There are certain pitches that won't seam at all, so you can swing the ball in the air. Reverse is still important when you can do it. Swing bowling doesn't have to die, and the skills don't have to die. But we now don't have a single bowler in Test cricket whose main strength is their outswinger. So Tim Southey is probably the last one, because Anderson had already changed over. I'm trying to think of anyone else in world cricket that was outswing dependent. Yeah, I think everyone else had already gone over. Southey was maybe one of the last holdouts, and he changed quite a while back as well. And the reason is that these are just other better options. And it doesn't mean you can't still bowl your outswinger or your in-swinger, because they're really, really good deliveries. And we're still seeing people like Kyle Jamieson come in and be able to do that. But the wobble ball is a better ball, and seaming in general is probably slightly more powerful as well. CD says, I think me and most Aussie supporters claim that Australia will lose 4-0 with each test by an innings, and this one washed away that theory. Look, you can go back to Headingley 2019 Ashes after that first innings. You can have a look at Adelaide 36 all out. There are many situations when a team looks absolutely terrible. And, there was the whole argument of the former Australian players that Australia wasn't hard enough, as if they were any harder in this test match. They just didn't go out as fast. And then their main spinner bowled, better for them. And perhaps the conditions helped a little bit more as well. We look for these ridiculous things. But, as fans, all you really have is, your overall beliefs and then what happened recently, right? I don't think any fans who thought it was going to be 4-0, and it still might be 4-0, of course, but after that last test are idiots. I don't think anyone, it's not something I look at and go, there's no factual basis for this, this reasoning, right? But at the same time, we see teams get bowled out and humbled and swept aside and then come back and play really good. The different tests, different lineups, different pitches, niggling injuries, all these things play a part. And so, there's always a chance that a team will fight back. They're certainly, at the very least, not going to lose this test by an innings. So, I suppose you're wrong in that way. Matlock Stevens says the Aussies are really missing Starc, who is great at wrapping up the tail, even though this Indian lower order is very strong. So there's two things I want to say. So I mentioned before, he's not particularly good at doing the tail. He's fine against the tail. This whole idea that Mitchell Starc is a brilliant bowler against the tail doesn't add up when you look at his numbers. He's slightly above average against the tail, but even then, not even as much that it's really all that noteworthy at all. It's something that's said a lot. He looks like he should be better against the tail, but there are very few bowlers in the world that are good at wrapping up the tail. The specialists that I found looking at the history of all the ball by ball data, I think the two guys I found were Stuart McGill and Shoaib Akhtar. And even then, Shoaib Akhtar had a pretty good record against the top order as well. It's just he was so good against the tail that it was hard not to see that. Stuart McGill was really poor against the top order and really good against the tail. But it's not something that happens that much. The opposite is true, though. I did find quite a few bowlers who are more specialists against the top order. So Hazelwood was one. I think Freddie Flintoff was another one. Is it Morne Morkel? I can't remember who the other one was. I feel like it was a South African bowler. But yeah, it might have been Callis, actually. But you do get those sorts of bowlers. So yeah, the whole Starc thing, it doesn't quite play out. The other thing I would say is, let's say that Starc is a really good bowler against the tail. Akshar Patel and Ravi Jadeja and Ashwin are not tail enders. Perhaps Ashwin is more of a tail ender if you pull him out of India, and perhaps the same is true of Akshar, who we haven't seen that much out of India. But they're not tail enders, are they? They're, Ashwin and Akshar are both probably above average number 8s. Ashwin in home conditions could probably moonlight 50% of the test matches as a number 7. Jadeja now, bats up the order, and, he was in at 6 again. We've seen him bat at 5. Yeah. Have we seen him bat at 4? I feel like, did he bat at 4 at Boxing Day test once? I can't remember. He's gone up the order a few times. So again, when you're saying you want someone to bowl at the tail, that isn't the tail. The tail for this team is Siraj and Shami. They didn't really have any problems getting through them this time. Last test, of course, was a different issue. And I don't think they always bowled particularly well against Shami in that last test. And having Starc as an option is better than not having. I think without knowing anything about Scott Boland's first-class record, I would assume that he's not going to have a better record against the tail than Mitchell Starc, just based on the way that he bowls. Charles says, is the decision not to pick Bolt worth it in the long term for New Zealand? Probably not. I mean, I get the logic. He's not always going to be available. He's not making it his first priority anymore. They want to find a new generation and move on from that perspective. I get it, and maybe it gives maybe they find another bowler earlier, or that bowler develops earlier, and that works for them. Maybe they're also saying to other New Zealand players, look, you can't have it both ways. You're either in or you're out with us, and so maybe those things work. However, I don't know. I don't see it as. I'd rather use Bolt for the next 2 or 3 years in a Jimmy Anderson kind of way. Reduced usage, maybe just playing him every now and again, and using him that way rather than just going, no, he's out and we're going to start again. I mean, Blair Tickner and Kuglon is more of an all-rounder, but Blair Tickner, I know he's not first choice because they would have had Matt Henry, and they do have other bowlers, but Bolt would have been a better bowler here than Matt Henry, and he certainly would have. They're not Matt Henry, Blair Tickner. I don't know if he would have been better than Matt Henry, but he certainly would have helped build a lot more pressure. Neil Wagner has really struggled when he's had the new ball in his hand, which traditionally he hasn't bowled with at test level. And they haven't been able to keep any pressure on. Bolt bowled really well at times in England, and he's a fantastic bowler. So I can see the long-term benefits, but I'm not sure that that's the best option. Sia Square says, Bazball really made New Zealand bowlers look like a weak side. Well, to be fair, it is a weak New Zealand bowling lineup. They have 2 bowlers who are absolutely stars of New Zealand cricket. And one of those is coming to the end, who is bowling 10K slower than he did at his peak. He's changed his bowling style completely. When he did go back to his old bowling style, he got absolutely hammered. You've then got Blair Tickner, who has a first-class bowling average of 35. I think the times when he was getting up towards 90 miles an hour, he did look like a slightly better bowler, but obviously did not do that consistently enough. Kugelheim is not a particularly good bowler. He's someone who can bowl a good ball, but it's not a consistently good bowler. He probably bowled better than I thought he would have in this test. And then you have a Bracewell. So in Kugelheim and Bracewell, you have probably what you would want to be your 5th bowler. And then in Tickner, you have someone who in perfect world would be your 4th best bowler, right? When you say they've made them look like a weaker side, this is a weaker side. That doesn't mean that England hasn't cashed in on it, and England didn't cause some of the issues themselves. Although Ben Duckett didn't bowl all those half volleys to himself, and England didn't waste the new ball twice when they bowled, and New Zealand did. So there are obvious mistakes they've made there. All right, I am going to just have one more break, and then after the break, I will get to the last questions, and then I will go to sleep.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
All right. Let's have a look. All right. Let's get to the last questions. Sorry, I can't find it. Here we go. Harsha, England baseball is a disgrace to Test cricket. What? They're winning Test matches. So to begin with, that's the aim. So well done there. They are playing to their strengths because their weaknesses were so glaring that they didn't have a choice. So again, that's really good. They may have changed the game forever. And like the West Indies and like Australia, it's fantastic to see when you live through a change. I think you really start to appreciate more how incredible it is. They've reinvigorated English Test fans and a lot of neutral Test fans, if we're being honest. How is this a disgrace? Like, I think it's really. I love the, and it's a bit like I really enjoyed what they did in white ball cricket as well. I love the batting side of it because I really like the idea of taking chances based on things being in your favor. So yes, it looks silly when Joe Root reverse paddle scoops a ball to Mitchell and is out at slip, but I do like the idea of Joe Root going, well, wait a minute, there's no one back there. If they're bowling wide of off stump, if I keep playing conventional off stump shots, eventually I might actually hit a ball to one of these fielders, or I might slice one there. If I'm going to do that, I might as well take a risk where I know I'm going to hit a boundary. There's a lot of logic to that. Again, when we talk about them, Wagner bowling short to them and then backing away and hitting it back down the ground, it's a ridiculous shot. And I'm sure there are going to be occasions when England players are out in Test matches playing that shot. But there's also no one at mid-on and mid-off, and they know this guy's going to come in and bowl short to them, right? They are taking educated risks in the way that they play. Their bowling's really interesting. I could have actually done something on that, and I might do a full video on it. But essentially, they are simplifying their bowling plans. And I think because of Broad and Anderson being so smart and being so old and being so experienced and all those different things, I think at times England bowlers had so many different theories. And you see it with Broad especially. We just like, maybe your best ball is being, 6'5" and bowling at the top of off stump. You don't need to try all these different things. But it's not how Broad went. But I think they've minimized the kind of options that they have now. And they're just like, okay, we're going to go with this plan, and this plan. And we're going to back them and see how they go. And again, they've gone really well so far. So, I mean, I find it hard to think that I don't know what on earth your problem could be, Harsha. They're winning. It's entertaining and it's smart. It's kind of what Test cricket should be. You talked about Kohli's control percentage. I think players like Pujara and Kohli who play extremely defensively will definitely have a high control percentage, but will face more unplayable balls. Well, they won't face more unplayable balls because that doesn't change what the bowlers do. And Kohli isn't a defensive player. He's nowhere near one of the more defensive players around. I mean, he hasn't scored a lot of recent times just because he hasn't scored a lot, but his first class record. He's played Test cricket, hasn't he? His Test record. So his strike rate is 55. That is anything above 50 is certainly not defensive. Between 45 and 50, you could be a strike rater like Alistair Cook. Between 40 and 45, you're probably a defensive player, and then under 40, you're probably quite slow. So that would be someone like Pujara. But Kohli's not particularly like that. If his strike rate has gone down in the last couple of years, which I can only assume it has, that's just because he hasn't been scoring at all. Let's have a look. Oh, but even so, 2021, his strike rate was 45. When was last year he made runs? Yeah, so when he was making runs, he had a high strike rate, and when he stopped, that's a fairly normal pattern. But I certainly wouldn't think of him as a defensive batter. I don't think he thinks defensively. Even the way he was playing Lyon today, his best form of scoring of defending against a Lion was really getting to the other end. That's the difference between a real defensive player would just be dead batting those back up the wicket. They wouldn't be moving across the stumps and turning them around the corner all the time. I should say your general point of view on the control percentage is true. The only thing I would say is that doesn't change the amount of balls that it takes to dismiss you, right? So even then, you would still expect him, even if he didn't play any attacking shots, you would still expect there to be 12 defensive mistakes for every 1 wicket. What you would expect is for there to be fewer defensive mistakes. But in his case, it isn't the fact that the control percentage is one part of it. The other part of it is that he's still being dismissed at a much higher rate than anyone else with that kind of control percentage would, and then also with that amount of mistakes would. So in 2 different ways, it's not really adding up from that perspective. Christopher says, Dale Steyn from memory was a bowler that was fairly good at wrapping up the tail. Yeah, I mean, so is Pat Cummins. So is Dale Steyn. Sorry, that's who you're talking about. So is Glenn McGrath. So is Shane Warne. So is Murali. So is Vernon Philander. Most good bowlers are good at wrapping up the tail. It's rare. The outliers, as I said, the only 2 outliers I really saw that were tail specialists were McGill and Shoaib Akhtar. There are players who are better against the tail than against the top order, but it's usually just a little bit. It's not. This whole specialist thing doesn't exist. So one of the most interesting pairings I saw as a bowling attack was Steve Harmison and Andy Flintoff, where Steve Harmison was better against the tail and Freddie Flintoff was terrible against the tail, but better against top order players, which is probably the reason why he had a slightly better, a bigger average, because he never cashed in against the tail. And so it's more likely that you're going to be better against the top order and not against the tail than vice versa. Those players just don't seem to get into Test cricket, and there's probably a selection bias there from that. But most of the best bowlers ever, like Dale Steyn, Rabada, Vernon Philander, McGrath, Cummins, Warne, Murali, Jadeja. Oh, actually, I think Jadeja. No, maybe Jadeja's another one who was slightly better against. Ashwin. They're all better. They're all really good against the tail, but we're all really good against the top order. So that pattern that people think doesn't really exist. Oh, certainly not in the numbers I've ever looked at. Vrickzed Gamer says, is Nathan Lyon alone complete spinner in Australia? I don't know what you mean by complete. I mean, Nathan Lyon is probably one of the few spinners in the world that can probably be dropped in any kind of pitch situation and do well. I think that's always been his main strength. He's not a guy who averages 20 in a bunch of different places and 50 in a bunch of other places. He really is a guy who consistently is a threat, but doesn't step up in Asia in the way that you would expect a spinner, but then is probably above average in places like England and Australia. I think New Zealand might be another one, where you wouldn't expect a spinner to play as big a part. There aren't many spinners like that in cricket. I mean, Nathan Lyon's got a really weird career, and I've talked about it a lot. The way he takes wickets earlier in the innings, the overspin equation. There's a video I did on Nathan Lyon probably a year or so back, which really explains how different he is to other spinners. So he's not in one way. In that way, he's the only spinner like him in Australia, but he's also maybe the only spinner like him kind of in the world. As far as spinners go, yeah, I mean they've got Kuhnemann. Swepson is a bit of a jump as well, and Murphy. Those are 3 guys that they're essentially taking a punt on, based on there isn't anyone else out there. I suppose you have guys like maybe John Holland. Who else am I missing? I feel like I'm missing a couple of other obvious ones. Steve O'Keefe's probably moved on a little bit. Chris Green. I almost said Chris Lynn again. Chris Green is another really interesting one of recent times. Trying to think. I feel like I'm missing someone else. Zampa wasn't that far away from getting here. Kind of shows you with guys like Green and Zampa and even Swepson, I suppose, to a certain degree, that they're kind of trying to make it happen, trying to make fetch happen. And they haven't been producing spinners for a very, very long time. Lyon was a bit of a fluke, really, in himself. Agar's really a very good athlete who can bowl spin rather than being a completely frontline spin bowler. Murphy's the best young spinner I've seen in Australia since Lyon. Kuhnemann doesn't have a particularly good record, although I thought he bowled well. And if Kuhnemann can be the guy that you bring in when you go to Asia and is just good at that, and Lyon and Murphy can be the frontline spinners, they're still in a better position than they were a week and a half ago. Probably prefer one of those guys could bat. Chitra says, should New Zealand just play spinners who are at least world class? I mean, Bracewell took wickets today. I thought that's a weird thing to say on the day that Bracewell took wickets. What I would say is this: they don't have a world class spinner. If they had a world class spinner, they'd be playing him. They're world class spinner. Ajaz Patel's a good bowler in Asia. That's about it. Will Somerville was never really front line. Ish Sodhi, he's a fine T20 bowler, but I don't think he's world class at the longer form of the game. Mitch Santner has never taken any wickets in Test match cricket. Am I missing something? If they had this player, I think why they like Bracewell, and I wrote about Bracewell recently. I think Bracewell's a really good guy to tour with, and I think he's a really good player to occasionally bring into the side. I don't think he's certainly not strong enough. I think they played him in one test in England where he was one of a 4-man bowling attack. And I say 4-man because they didn't bowl Darryl Mitchell much or at all in that test match. And you're just like, well, Bracewell can't be a 4-man bowling attack. Even in this test, you saw, he probably shouldn't be, counted on. As the fifth bowler, though, he's not particularly terrible. They've also got the other guy, is it Ravi Ravindra? I think that's his name, who played in India. Who I quite liked. And, those two guys, I think, give them a little bit of flexibility going ahead. Both interesting batting talents as well. Both really good kind of crickety guys, if that makes sense. Good fielders, good batters, good bowlers, but not particularly frontline in any of their skills, if we're being honest, at test level. But I think that gives them good flexibility. But if they're going to pick Bracewell, they have to back him up with better bowlers around him. I don't think that you can then throw in. I think the third bowler then has to be very, very, very strong, and then you can get away with Kugelheim or a Bracewell or the other Bracewell, Doug Bracewell, or De Grandhomme's gone, but that kind of bowler, Jimmy Neesham if he plays first class cricket ever again, those sorts of players. But as far as New Zealand, so in the last 6 years in New Zealand, the bowling average in Test cricket for spin was 60. Obviously, a lot of that is New Zealand spinners, but to show the opposition spinners aren't doing any better. It's just not conditions made for spin bowling, and traditionally, I would say it never has been. In a way that South Africa has been recently, and England used to be traditionally. Australia was at a time back in the old days. I don't think even in the old days in New Zealand, spinners ever did particularly well. So, Vittori and John Bracewell stand out. I'm trying to think if I'm missing anyone else. I think those are the two that have played for them. And those are both good bowlers, but those are, again, not star international bowlers, but really, really good, solid players and very clever players and very handy players to have in your team. If New Zealand had anyone like that now, they'd be playing. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up. Probably won't be much on the England-New Zealand game tomorrow. Can't wait to get up at midnight to go and watch what could be 45 minutes of cricket. But obviously I'll be watching a bit of the India. I'll probably watch all of the India-Australia test tomorrow. I watched most of it today. We've got some cool videos coming up, some of which will come up right after the test match is finished, but we'll certainly do another mood board. The reason we didn't do a mood board yesterday, by the way, was just that Muku was sick and I had some other things, and it would have been Cheyenne on his own with me having to voice it, having not seen a lot of cricket or having much time to do much of the writing, especially with the India-Australia game. So I thought it was best to skip it, but we'll try and do them as much as possible for the rest of the series. But so if you like the mood board and you want to hear more of this, like, subscribe, press the bell icon, all the things that Muku has just put up on this slide here. And I will see you again tomorrow. I can't